right, so again, thank you all for joining us here tonight. Very excited for tonight's presentation. While many believe that extraterrestrials lie behind the phenomenon commonly known as alien abductions, a robust folklore tradition points to another culprit, the Faeries. The key to understanding the UFO contact experience may well lie in the legends of Changelings, where fairies kidnapped healthy human babies and replaced them with something much more sinister. Set aside quaint notions from childhood storybooks and join Joshua Cutchin as he explores the history of these mischievous, dangerous entities. Cutchin has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM, Mysterious Universe, Binnall of America, Expanded Perspectives, Radio Misterioso, and the Gralien Report. And he's the author of several books, including A Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, Thieves in the Night, and Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1, Folklore. Let's see how many we have live at the moment. So we got about 50 or so live with this, and I'm sure the hundreds that are going to be watching after the fact. Let's give a big round virtual applause for Joshua for joining us here tonight. And Joshua, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much, Robert, and special thanks to the Tewksbury Public Library. It's a real privilege to do this. It's my favorite time of year because, as I tell all my friends, this is the time of year when people really care about the things that a lot of us who are involved in the paranormal care about. So for one shining, month, we get to be amongst, we get to sort of crawl out of our hidey holes and people don't look at us like we're as crazy as we actually are. I say that with all the love in my heart. So as Robert mentioned, my name is Joshua Cutchin. I started writing books on the paranormal in 2015, and quickly, for whatever reason, and I really can't quite put a pin in it, but for whatever reason, I really resonated with fairy folklore, in particular, the fairy folklore of Western Europe. It's where my ancestry is from, and it's just, for some reason, it's always seemed it seemed highly explicative of me, of very various different sort of paranormal phenomena. One of the things that I am especially interested in is the overlap between fairy folklore and the alien abduction experience. A lot of people tend to think that the UFO phenomena is extraterrestrial in nature, and while I don't write that off as a possibility, I think that there is another equally compelling body of evidence in fairy folklore. So the first thing we've got to do, though, before we actually establish this, is to talk about what fairies actually are. The key point is to throw out your traditional ideas of fairies. We're all familiar with these Disney-fied Tinkerbell versions of fairies, little tiny feminine women floating around the bottom of the garden with their wings. That is a very children's book notion, as alluded to in the description of this talk. One of the best ways to think about the fairy folk in their actual incarnation, if you look in the literature, if you look to fairy stories rather than fairy tales, are as perhaps spirits of place. There are a lot of different schools of thought on exactly what the fairies were. When theosophy came around as a discipline, people began thinking that they were somehow elementals tied to different aspects of nature. But there's equally compelling evidence that they're associated with the human dead as well. Exactly how this all plays out, no one is really sure. Scholars are still confused. But the one thing that is for certain is that there is a body of folklore about what fairies were and the do's and don'ts of having them in your life. So, having established that, let's compare fairy folklore to what is commonly known as the alien abduction experience, just to illustrate the similarities between these two bodies of work. The most prescient examination of this, and the first, was Jacques Vallée's 1969 book, Passport to Magonia, that made a lot of the points that I'm going to make here, although I've taken them and elaborated them a little bit. The similarity between fairies and aliens, for me, has become so complex and mixed up that I actually kind of prefer the term phalians instead of fairies or aliens. I don't think that the fairies were aliens. I don't think that aliens are fairies. I think that both of these bodies of, for lack of a better term, mythology are describing the same objectively real phenomena. As to the true nature of that, I'm not sure. It's just different ways that people, depending upon their cultures, describe this same body of work. So, the first thing that people will notice is stature. Fairies are short. They like to wear green. And what did we all call aliens in the 1950s but little green men? So that's a pretty obvious correlation that you can make. Lights. Nowadays, if you see lights in the sky or even sometimes lights across the landscape, you assume that they're UFOs or flying saucers or extraterrestrial technology. But those same lights have had numerous names throughout indigenous cultures across the world, from fairy lights to even witch lights and ghost lights as well. But they're very closely associated with areas that are sacred sites that are associated with fairy activity. Typically, these were ring forts or older, basically ruins that supposedly the fairies took up residence in. And even to this day, you can talk to some people in Ireland who say, yep, every night up there at the ring fort, you'll see little lights dancing along. The picture here on the left-hand side of the screen is the infamous Phoenix Lights UFO incident. But again, really culture and context dependent. If you had seen this in 19th century Ireland, you would have probably associated it with fairy activity. Wands, another point of comparison. Fairies were often seen having these wands with which they could do all sorts of different things. We'll get to some of those effects in a moment. I don't necessarily agree with this very detailed picture of an alien portable stun pack, but rather I'm just using that to illustrate the fact that especially when you have descriptions of landed craft and little aliens walking around them, they oftentimes will have what resembles a wand. And of course, we all associate fairies and magic wands with being with that body of folklore. The Fae Queen motif. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. Typically in alien abductions, you'll have these shorter entities. In America, in the 21st century, normally these are gray aliens, although there are many types that people describe. But you'll have shorter entities scurrying around doing manual labor, and they will almost always be supervised by a taller entity, sometimes as tall as a human being or even taller than a human being. This is directly mirrored in fairy folklore with the fairy queen motif, where you'd have actually the tiny little fairies running around, and you would actually have a taller fairy queen who looked more like a human being surveying them. If anybody's a fan of the Jim Henson film Labyrinth, this is sort of exemplified by David Bowie being the tall goblin king with all the little goblins running around him. Offhand comments. What I mean by this is just general things that you can pick out here and there that aren't really consistent motifs, but really do speak to the fact that we might be dealing with the same phenomena. There's a great example of a story, I believe it's a Cornish folktale called Fairy Dwelling on Selina Moor, where the person who is actually stuck in fairyland is told by someone else who is trapped in fairyland that the fairies were not Christians, but they were from the stars and that they were star worshippers. Paralysis, a very common prelude to many alien abduction stories. This same ability was attributed to the fairies. Either they would use elf shot, which is like literally tiny little bows and arrows, or they would use their touch, the fairy stroke, which is actually where we get the modern medical term stroke from. It usually was associated at one point with being touched or being affected by the supernatural. But again, that would manifest not necessarily in terms of our medical understanding of the stroke nowadays, but just in terms of basic paralysis. Levitation sort of speaks for itself in alien abduction narrative. Sometimes people will literally levitate through their ceiling into what they perceive as a craft. Similarly, fairies not only could levitate others, but had the powers of levitation themselves, which you do see in some abduction literature. This is likely the origin for fairies having wings and flying around, is this common motif of fairies levitating. Being pixie-led, this is another favorite of mine. It's very common in modern alien abduction stories to be led down a road that you have no reason to go down. You're just compelled to drive down this road, and that's where you'll encounter this strange craft. It's a very common theme amongst a lot of abductees. Well, in Cornwall, where the fairies were called pixies, this phenomena would be known as being pixie-led, and it could not only manifest in that way, but also as the idea that fairies would enchant you, go down a road that you should know exactly how to get to and from your home, but you get out into the wilderness and you get turned around and wouldn't know how to get home. That was being called pixie-led, so another similarity there. Fairy rings versus crop circles. This is pretty self-explanatory. Most crop circles are, hate to break it to you, hoaxes, although strange things do happen in crop circles, and there are genuinely anomalous crop circles. Similarly, fairy rings, if you ever have a lawn care professional come out and help you, are these rings and circles of fungi, which in some traditions were literally believed rather to be the result of fairies dancing in a circle. And that was another common motif, is that fairies would dance into a circle and sometimes blur and travel into the sky. You see where we're going with this. Underground habitats. With very few exceptions, fairyland was depicted as being an underground domain. Now, sometimes this was an underground alternate dimension, sometimes it was underground but also dreamland, but there's usually typically an underground component to a lot of fairy lore. Similarly, in modern ufology, people claim that there are any number of underground alien bases that exist. A quick aside here, I'm kind of agnostic about the specifics of these things, but I'm always very compelled when you have the motifs repeating similarly across different times and generations and locations. It's always very compelling to me. So, do I believe in alien underground bases? I don't know. I'm inclined to say no, but I think it's more of an expression of this motif. Elaborate taxonomies. As I mentioned earlier, we're used to seeing these gray aliens, but the truth of the matter is, as illustrated by this rather well put together alien timeline, people see everything. One of my favorite alien abduction stories actually involves several aliens that, according to the witness, looked like giant bananas covered in terry cloth, which is just one of the goofiest things you've ever heard. But we see that again with fairy folklore. If you pick up a fairy encyclopedia, the sort of entities that were cataloged under this umbrella of fairies is striking. I mean, leprechauns, literally fairies, pixies, kobolds, but even things that we normally wouldn't associate with fairies are also part of this fairy family. So mermaids, trolls, ogres, giants, counterintuitively enough, are often considered, at least from a mythological standpoint, as sort of being members of the fairy family. Livestock mutilation. We're all very familiar with that old trope vis-a-vis the UFO literature, where supposedly aliens are taking and mutilating livestock and leaving behind carcasses. This exact same phenomena is described in the British Isles and almost universally attributed in those cases to being a fairy harvest, in which case it was deemed that the fairies had taken parts of the cows, either metaphysically or literally, and that particular carcass shouldn't be touched, shouldn't be eaten. It was part of the fairy harvest. You just wrote it off as part of the cost of being a farmer. Missing time. This commonly manifests itself in ufology as someone taking a journey that should take 3 hours and it takes 7 hours, and they have no idea, they have no recollection of where that time was, the implication being that they were actually abducted during that time. This motif presents itself in a lot of stories of people who travel to fairyland, where they will emerge, and instead of emerging hours or days later, they'll actually emerge years later, in some instances hundreds of years later, where they crumble into dust. So again, this motif keeps repeating itself. Alien implants. This was a surprising one. A lot of people think that extraterrestrials put implants or transceivers under abductees' skin. Again, I'm really agnostic about the reality of that, but the truth of the matter is that you can see a similar thing in fairy lore as well. The words blast, blustery, and blister all share the same Germanic root. The idea was that a fairy blast of wind on a blustery day would leave you with a blister. And there is no shortage of various foreign objects inside these blisters in the literature. Things like rocks, twigs, bones, feathers, even string, which again correspond to this motif of something from the other world, some sort of other intelligence, putting a foreign object underneath the skin. And then finally, an obsession with children and reproduction. It's very commonly believed that alien abductions began in childhood, and the fairies had an absolute obsession with abducting children. So what I'm trying to say is, therefore, fae folk. I've sort of got this reputation amongst my friends, and it's not inaccurate, but I just like to poke a little fun at myself. So, we should talk about the changeling phenomena, specifically as it is represented in this theme of child abduction amongst the fairies. What is a changeling? Well, a changeling, as presented here in this art, Der Wechselbalg, which is German for the changeling, is a belief that a fairy would take a child when no one was looking and replace it with a substitute of some kind. Changeling. This is a belief that you'll find literally the world over. In my book, Thieves in the Night, oh, I get to plug it. In my book, Thieves in the Night, I actually talk about this motif not only expressed in Europe, but also Native America, island Southeast Asia, Russia, Australia, literally the world over, even Africa. This idea of something taking people and taking children and replacing it with a substitute is really a sort of human universal. Now, they would take a child and they would exchange it with something. There were a variety of preventative measures and criteria for which children would be taken, but we won't discuss them here because we only have so much time. That's actually the topic of that book. Is the reason I can't read the whole book because it would take a long time, but that's the general idea. And what they would replace this child with would be one of several things. The fairies would take a human infant and replace it with either a fairy baby, an old member of the fairy community, or what is known as a stock or a fetch. We will discuss stocks and fetches towards the end of our discussion. But it should be noted that the changeling archetype is very common and even finds its way into Christianity. There is a text where Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, actually described meeting a changeling. And I believe, if memory serves in that anecdote, the child was thrown into the river. It's a little dark, folks, so just a little bit of a trigger warning. So we've established that they're either fairy babies or old fairies, or these things called stocks and fetches, which we'll circle right back around to at the end of our discussion. But let's describe these changelings and the way that they appear. Oh, well, I should have remembered this. Yeah, yeah. Here's that exact excerpt from Martin Luther's account of seeing a changeling where it was thrown into the river. I forgot that I had that slide up there. And you'll see that Luther checks off some things that we'll be touching on here in a moment about the way that the children, these changeling children, would overconsume and be listless and very capricious. So these attributes, generally described as, and I don't have a lot of citations here because these are incredibly consistent across all of European literature. These changelings were described as hideous. They were scrawny or sickly, oftentimes appearing listless and not really moving much. They had wispy hair. They were constantly begging for food and never ever satisfied. They usually ate more than anyone else in the family. They tended to be stunted in their growth. They had shriveled features, oftentimes being compared to being simian or wizened. Is another very common description. Gangly limbs, long, thin, gangly limbs. Occasionally they would have outsized eyes that are larger than human eyes. A large outside head. The term Wechselbalg is only one of several terms for changelings in German folklore. The others are Kielkrop and Dummkopf, which both refer to the size of the changeling's head. As you can imagine, there is a very sensitive subject here that I do go into depth in the book. A lot of these attributes were used to justify infanticide, and there are a host of developmental disabilities that these might have been describing. I am not presenting any of this to downplay any of those very realistic, very concerning things. But at the same time, it is interesting to view this body of folklore with the while entertaining the idea that it could actually represent some sort of otherworldly contact. And the manner in which this really dovetails with the alien hybrid experience, I think will illustrate that we are at least dealing with something at a level of the collective unconscious, or perhaps even a mythopoetic level. So I just want everybody to, in my book, I have an entire chapter dedicated to what possible medical conditions this could be describing, and some very sobering, very depressing statistics. That description perfectly matches a lot of descriptions of alien hybrids. Obviously the large head and large eyes thing you'll hear. This similarity has been noted ad nauseum, perhaps no better than in Graham Hancock's book, Supernatural. There's not a lot of art to reflect this, so I had to sort of pick and choose here. But in modern ufological lore, there is an idea that these extraterrestrials, which again, I would push back on them being definitively extraterrestrials, but there's an idea that extraterrestrials are harvesting gametes from human beings and combining them either with the gametes from another abductee and or the genetic material from extraterrestrials. A lot of people, in particular David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins, two very famous ufologists, believe that the abduction phenomena is part of a hybridization plot to overtake the world. So depending on what UFO literature you read, these children are either grown in test tubes or they're literally taken out of women's wombs. And sometimes either there's a normal human baby that's taken out and replaced with an alien baby, or this alien fertilized egg is placed into the human woman's stomach. I don't really ascribe to either of those. I think we're dealing with something on a much more motivic, again, mythopoetic level, not to overuse that term, but that's sort of where I stand on this particularly. You'll hear plenty of stories. It's a very common trope in amongst alien abductees, or alleged alien abductees, I should say, of having what is basically called missing fetus syndrome. The idea that these aliens literally take children, or they use women to incubate their hybrid children and then take them for whatever purpose. Here's another good, that's probably one of the better depictions of the way that these alien hybrids are described. They are often seen aboard flying saucers, alien spacecraft, depending on how you want to phrase it. Very rarely seen on Earth in public. This is all firsthand knowledge, supposedly, of abductees who will meet their children aboard an alien spacecraft. So then we have these two bodies of folklore, the changeling and the alien hybrid. Let's sort of pull this apart some more and see some of the ways that these two phenomena tend to echo each other. So, there is a degree of basis for the assumption that these alien human hybrids are actually clones. One of Carla Turner's abductees, she was a famous ufologist who's since passed away, claimed that she saw a full room of inert male and female human bodies who were beautiful and identical. In 2017, Brett Oldham, who was the gentleman whose book cover I just showed, claimed that he saw a room full of clones. Another famous abductee studied by Bud Hopkins, Virginia Horton, claimed that she was, quote unquote, introduced in the sky house to my sister, who looked exactly like me. She was a clone. This is Antonio Alves Ferreira. He, at the time of his experiences, was 19 years old. His experiences began when he was 11, however. He was a native of Brazil. He had one experience that was written by Irene Granchi in the periodical Flying Saucer Review. He claimed to have actually seen a double of him replaced in his house. He said shortly afterwards on a screen, he saw his double sitting at a table in his house. A few moments later, its head drooped and it was asleep. Now, of course, this is interesting because we have this idea of fairies taking infants and trying to replace them with something in the hopes that they, the human beings wouldn't notice what was being taken. We'll get to the motives behind this in a little bit. The key here is that there's some sort of exchange of trying to pull one over on human beings. In Ferreira's case, he later went on to say that when his father came to take his double that he was viewing on the screen while he was in a flying saucer. When his father came to take his double to a hammock for a nap, he found that the boy had become so heavy that it was impossible for him to carry alone. This is an interesting detail because all sorts of denizens of the other world, witches, demons, and fairies, were described as being incredibly heavy. You can even see this this heaviness of this being of the other world in the Japanese kaiju named the Konakajiji, which had an old man's face, sounds just like the changelings that I mentioned, cried in the forest, which is sort of a recurring motif amongst a lot of supernatural phenomena, this idea of being in the forest and hearing a child or an infant crying, and was so heavy that when you picked it up, it would actually crush you. We see the same belief manifested in an Irish folktale about a changeling. There was a mother wading into a river to toss a changeling into the river and found it growing, quote unquote, heavy as lead, eventually ripping through the quilt as a heavy stone would rip through a muslin handkerchief. So another interesting point of comparison there, the idea that these beings have some sort of extra density. Again, not sure if there's a literal interpretation of that or not, but the motif is almost identical. There's another interesting aspect known as soul swapping. This is a relatively under-discussed aspect of the abduction experience, but it also ties into this concept of clones. Ted Rice, who was an abductee that was being studied by Carla Turner, whom I mentioned earlier, had a lifetime full of experiences, but on one particularly compelling experience, he claimed that he was taken at 8 years old and cloned, and remembered being returned to the house in a dark, swirling atmosphere. And all of my relatives saw what they thought was a tornado. This is an interesting point because, as we mentioned earlier with the fairy blast, inclement weather was almost always associated with the fairies, to the extent that people would see storms and assume that it was the fairy host riding across the landscape in Western Europe. Once he was inside a strange room aboard a craft, Ted Rice said that 2 gray aliens stripped him naked and forced him to drink a strange liquid, which somehow separated his soul from his body and was transferred into the clone body. Again, just put a pin in that because we're going to come back around to that with the changeling lore. Whitley Strieber, author of Communion, wrote in his book, The Supernatural, that he was waiting on a friend to pass away in the waiting room of a hospital. And while he was there, he had an intense vision of these squat blue entities that he often likened to kobolds, which are a German fairy variant depicted there, who are dragging this man's soul through the squalor of an Indian slum. Normally, someone having a vision like this would just be written up to a reverie or a daydream. But when you look at Whitley Strieber's body of work and the manner in which he has had, or claimed at least, contact experiences, intense contact experiences through the years, it puts it in a little bit more interesting light. Strieber says that after these fairies took his friend's soul away, he actually had more of that vision that he imparted in his book. He said, "Then he was gone, and in his place there was a tiny baby girl being held by her father. The baby's eyes widened with what seemed to me to be an adult recognition, and the infant began screaming terribly, waving its arms and kicking, its eyes practically popping out of its head. The frantic parents tried to comfort it, and the vision was gone." Another soul-swapping variant. There's actually another story from ufologist Jenny Randalls, who claimed that an abductee that she was studying took her 9-month-old child into a garden, and the child began screaming. Randalls writes, "When the girl grew older, it became clear that the child felt that she was somehow different. In fact, she had relinquished her body and allowed an alien entity to take it over during that brief moment in her pram in the garden." Now, I feel like I'm asking a lot of everyone because not only are there aliens, but they're taking people's souls. Again, I'm not sure how much I believe that, but I have to draw the comparison to fairy folklore. Walter Evans Wentz, who is author of one of the most comprehensive studies of fairy folklore, 1911's Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, wrote that the soul-swapping concept, years before people would talk about it in ufology, was actually a proposed mechanism by which the changeling phenomena took place. Evans Wentz writes, "Comparative study shows that non-Celtic changeling beliefs parallel to those of the Celts exist almost everywhere. that they center around the primitive idea that the human soul can be abstracted from the body by disembodied spirits and by magicians, and that they do not depend upon the sacrifice theory, though animalistically closely related to it. For example, according to the Lepers Islanders, ghosts steal men, as fairies do, to add them to their company, and if a man has left children when he died, one of whom sickens afterwards, it is said that the dead father takes it. Evans Wentz further writes, like their predecessors, the Egyptians, the Greeks also often represented the soul as a small winged human figure, and Romans, in turn, imagined the soul as a pygmy with butterfly wings. These ideas reappear in medieval reliefs and pictures wherein the soul is shown as a child or a little naked man going out of the person's dying mouth. There is now, and was in past ages, a worldwide belief that the human soul is in stature a pygmy. Obviously, this resonates with fairy folklore, and we have this idea of soul swapping being a mechanism for the changeling phenomenon. Changelings in utero, I'll keep this sort of brief, but I mentioned earlier about how aliens allegedly take abductees' pregnancies and will actually open up a pregnant woman, take out the human baby, put in a hybrid child. This is that same idea of stealing a human child and putting something foreign in its place, echoed in modern abduction literature. This next topic I find really fascinating. It's vanishing twin syndrome. When I was writing this, my wife was pregnant with identical twin boys who are 19 months old now. So there's some difficult things that I was having to write about, but vanishing twin syndrome is not entirely well understood. Before we go into this, I want everybody to remember that changelings were allegedly voracious and were never satisfied by food. A researcher by the name of Carol Dennis claims that vanishing twin syndrome might be a manifestation of alien or extraterrestrial influence. Your mileage may vary. One moment, please. Vanishing twin syndrome, for anyone who doesn't know, you've probably heard about it. It's where a multiple birth, one of the fetuses is absorbed by its sibling. It actually happens in 30% of multifetal pregnancies. There is an example that Carol Dennis gives in one of her books on the subject, where a child was actually born, but when the mother was had her cesarean, it was revealed that there were actually two umbilical cords, one of which was healed over, quote unquote, like an amputee's stump. The doctor at the time had no explanation, except that the baby may have at some point in the pregnancy had a twin. When the surviving daughter was about 9 years old, her father asked her if she knew she was supposed to be a twin. She explained, "Yes, Daddy, I know. I know where my twin sister is. She's on the spaceship and I talk to her all the time." You might recall that I alluded to earlier the fact that fairies were often conflated with the dead. And if we extend the metaphor that aliens and fairies might be one and the same, then you can see a clear parallel here as well. But interesting too is that the idea of incorporating the vanishing twin syndrome into the alien abduction experience reinvents the changeling motif. In this case, supernatural forces kidnap an identical version of a child, in this case, the vanished twin. From this perspective, the surviving child is the changeling, the child here on Earth, while its more perfect idealized double lives carefree in the other world. So fairyland, aboard a flying saucer, Zeta Reticuli, however you want to conceptualize it. Some people might be a little bit critical of this because it's literally the opposite of the changeling motif. And they're like, well, how can you compare these things as being motivically resonant? But I have a contention that inversion equals representation. And what I mean by that is, if any of you are musicians at all, if you have two notes, let's say a C and an E, that is a major third. If the C is on the bottom, C to E is a major third. However, if you have an E on the bottom, voiced on the bottom, and a C above it, it's a minor sixth. Same notes, but the way that you stack them, the inversion of it, changes the quality of it. So in this case, I see, when you're dealing with similarities between fairy folklore and alien folklore, that really inversion is some form of representation. To sort of give people a little bit of a clear idea of what I mean by this, as early as the 1300s, the fairies supposedly began an exodus from the world of men. For whatever reason, no one knows. Fairies are still literally cited to this day. But having said that, they're always supposedly going and going, but they never really quite disappear. This is reflected in the work of Patrick Harper, who says, the fairies are always going, but never gone. On the other hand, ufologists and New Age believers alike swear that extraterrestrials are always coming, but never here. So again, inversion as representation. Interestingly, with the vanishing twin syndrome aspect, some survivors of vanishing twin syndrome actually behave like changelings. Psychologist Alice Rose holds that in surviving twins, the guilt of taking too much nourishment in their mother's womb ingrained in their psyche might render them insatiable. Surviving twins may sneak food and eat when no one else can discover them, she wrote, or they may be secretly greedy about food. They may wolf down food or be unable to wait to eat. So once you have a changeling, what do you do with it? Well, it's clear, even if we believe in the supernatural, that a lot of the old changeling stories were a means of getting rid of disabled children. I don't really want to gloss over this fact, but I'm looking at the clock here. There's actually a story, or rather a survey of infanticide in Ireland called A Most Diabolical Deed, Infanticide in Irish Society, 1850 to 1900, written by Elaine Farrell. Ireland is about the size of Indiana. Farrell looked at a 50-year period, 1850 to 1900, and looked at only instances of infanticide where children were less than 3 years old. In that 50-year period, she saw 4,645 cases of recorded infanticide. So I feel like it's always very important to address this because that's an incredibly sobering statistic, and I don't want to gloss over that as being the product of a lot of what we're about to discuss. If you're familiar with the witch trials of Salem, you have a pretty good idea of some of the means by which changelings were rectified. So there was an idea that you would basically abuse the changeling to the extent that the fairy folk would come back and retrieve one of their own because they didn't want to see any ill harm to come to one of their own members. So basically any form of abuse you can imagine was the prescribed remedy for getting rid of a changeling, including placing them above flames, in chimneys, and etc. This particular aspect is rarely referenced in hybrid lore, with one exception. There is one exception that I found, at least. There's an alien abductee named Catherine Wilson who had a dream that she was in a hospital environment and she was given a feeble infant, which she thought was a hybrid in this sort of dream, maybe abduction. She wasn't sure. She was given this infant by what was this alien nurse and was instructed to put the child into an incinerator where people were putting other babies into this incinerator. But somehow in Catherine Wilson's mind, in this dream state, alien abduction state, whatever it was, she knew intuitively that this device doubled as a rejuvenator that would heal children. So in this recollection that she had under hypnosis, Wilson supposedly recalled placing this sickly hybrid child into this alien incinerator, and out came a perfectly healthy human baby. Again, the motif is exactly the same as putting a changeling into the chimney and having your child be returned to you by the fairies. It was also very common to abandon these changelings at liminal sites, by which I mean sites where things meet, crossroads, open graves, and the seashore. Again, this is not really reflected that much in hybrid lore, with a few exceptions. There was a case that I found out of Orange County, New York, where in 1977 a woman miscarried, and she was an abductee, and the abductees claimed that she should take her miscarried fetus to the crossroads. The disposition of changelings and these alien hybrids, both are generally regarded as sickly and listless, rarely voracious, in fact, quite the opposite in these hybrid accounts. So that, again, is a point of discrepancy. Even though both changelings and these alien hybrids were sickly and listless and wouldn't move, the changelings love to eat, and the hybrids in a lot of these stories don't love to eat. But remember, inversion equals representation, so I think that's a pretty easy way to justify that. Some of you may have heard the concept of indigo or star children. Some claim that these alien hybrids that I've been discussing are here to take over or evolve humanity. These are often called indigo or star children. They look like normal human beings, but possess exceptional intelligence, beauty, empathy, and psychic abilities. They are exceedingly healthy, but often precocious, intellectually gifted, resistant to authority, and struggle with the mundane, non-creative aspects of life, such as public education. They are the polar opposite of changelings, right? You have this wonderful child that's been given to you by these supernatural forces, and it's wonderful, versus the changeling, this child that's given to you by supernatural forces, and it's awful. But again, inversion is representation. In some cases, these indigo children are actually alien souls down here on the earth. And Bud Hopkins, famous ufologist, said that a very young abductee is often systematically trained to believe, in effect, that the woman who lives at home on Earth is a false mother or an unrelated imposter. Here we have inversion as representation once more. In this case, the modern alien abduction folklore frames the parents as the changelings, the parents as the imposters. So what was the longevity of these changelings? Well, there were two types of changelings when they survived. Typically, these changelings, if they weren't mistaken mortal children killed by the abuses of their parents, and they weren't returned by the fairies, as there are in stories, because many of these fairy stories do have happy endings where the human child is returned. If the changeling was kept in the family and ended up surviving, they would typically become one of two things. The changelings would often become basically village idiots. The term oaf is actually derived etymologically from the word elf, but they would often be dullards, immobile, and inarticulate in most cases. There are some exceptions. By comparison, human-fairy hybrids, which were not necessarily exchanged for infants, but just grew up as being the child of a human and fairy union, would often survive and would often have attributes almost identical to the indigo children or the star children that I just described. Lady Wilde, who was Oscar Wilde's mother and a preeminent Irish folklorist, described these children as quote-unquote headstrong, independent, passionate, proud, bold, and reckless, with a strange mystic nature, gaining fame through music and song. They were passionate, revengeful, and not easy to live with. Sounds exactly like the indigo children I was just describing. This is really but a small representation of the similarities between changelings and alien hybrids. For example, there's another phenomena in ufology described as the baby presentation, where the abductee is actually presented with their hybrid baby. And there's a series of folkloric tales called The Midwife or The Wet Nurse to the Faeries that seem to directly echo this phenomena as well. But now that we've established all this, what were changelings? Well, changelings were sometimes fairy babies. The reason that they were fairy babies, you take a human child, you give back a fairy baby, were for several reasons. Often the primary reason for this exchange was that fairy babies needed milk. Fairy food was often considered a sham. My first book, A Trojan Feast, details this concept where fairies actually don't eat actual food. Because of this, fairy milk was a sham, so they actually needed to take human milk. There's any milk. This is actually paralleled in alien hybrid lore. As we mentioned earlier, oftentimes an abductee is needed because the aliens are a dying race. Similarly, you'll find this exact same excuse amongst the fairies, is that, oh, they're part of a dying race and they need to have new blood in their lives, and they need our genetic material. It's the exact same idea. There's an interesting example with this need for changelings to have human milk. It's paralleled as described as in David Jacobs' book, Secret Life. He's an abduction specialist. The woman, in this case an alien abductee, here's another directive: nurse the baby, put the baby to your breast and feed the baby. The woman says, but I do not have any milk. The response is, put the baby to your breast and nurse the baby. Saying no is futile. If she resists, the aliens will put the baby to her breast anyway. It cups its mouth on her nipple. It has a very weak sucking reflex. In many instances, the woman may be surprised to find that she is lactating and that her breasts are engorged. When that happens, the baby will partially drain the breast. Often, however, nursing the baby is futile, but seems to satisfy the watchful aliens nonetheless. So again, not only an emphasis on human genetic material, but also an emphasis on human milk in both the changeling lore and in modern alien hybrid lore. Changelings were also sometimes old fairies, however. I alluded to the need for new blood. Obviously, this finds parallels in the modern alien hybrid project, whatever you think of it. In this sense, the fairies would get healthy human infant to sort of punch up their bloodline, while at the same time allowing their older fairies to enjoy a sort of hospice situation amongst human beings. This is it's interesting because one of the main ways to get a changeling to reveal itself, one of the more humane ways, I should say, was to present them with something absurd, in which case they'd say, well, I've been around for 1,000 years and I've never seen something so bizarre in my life. And this would be the tell by which you'd out them as being an old fairy man. Interestingly enough, this is actually, again, paralleled in the hybrid lore. For Carla Turner, she actually described abductees who described their hybrid children as being wizened. In this one case, this abductee says, then when he was wanting to nurse her hybrid child, I had this really weird thought, sort of apart from the dream, like standing off a little watching the dream. I thought, what if he isn't really a baby? What if he was really some midget pervert? I emphasize this last part because it indicates an awareness that we might be interacting with something less human and less innocent than it seemed. So this idea that these alien hybrids are also old souls, again, parallels the old fairies that were exchanged for changelings. Finally, we have this concept of stocks and fetches, which is where we will wind up with finishing this conversation. Stocks and fetches were possibly best depicted in popular culture in did I miss one? No, I didn't miss one. Okay. In a couple of different things. I think that motivically it's represented in Twin Peaks here. But these were literally logs or some sort of simulacra, logs in the shape of a human being that the fairies would cloak with glamour to appear as a human child. The best pop culture, here's what I thought I was getting into. The best pop culture example of this came in the Netflix series Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, when they actually find the moss oak. So that series deals with fairy folklore quite a bit, does a pretty good job with it. But this is the only example of the fairy stock being explicitly represented in popular culture that I've been able to find. So very brief clip that I'll play for everyone right now.
I have found it. The moss oak is in there. Reach in, Stephen. Take it. That's it, Stephen. You feel it? There is nothing once born. That's it, Stephen. Straddle. For 1,000 years, it has been waiting to learn what form it will take. Tears of the lady, shed in pain. Beautiful. Beautiful.
So to my knowledge, that's the only depiction, a really consistent depiction of the stock and fetch. So changelings were where fairies would take a human infant and replace it either with a fairy child, an elderly fairy, or a stock or a fetch. So stocks, we'll get to that in a moment. What was a fetch? Well, fetch has an obvious meaning as a noun, to grab or to take. However, it was also an antiquated term for a trick or deception, which seems appropriate. Also, it was defined as the apparition of a living person, specter, or a double. Also, to further elaborate on this, we have the Irish fetch is a sort of variation on the wraith, an exact facsimile of a living person who may himself see it. Goethe, Shelley, and other famous men are said to have seen their own wraiths. The fetch makes its appearance shortly before the death of the person it represents, either to himself or his friends, or both. The fetch was also, in some examples, a doppelganger or eidolon, according to Patrick Kennedy's legendary fictions of the Irish Celts. So the other term for this log child was a stock. The term stock is most likely a horticultural term in this case. The trunk or woody stem of a living tree or shrub, especially one into which a graft or scion is inserted. Interestingly enough, Robert Kirk, author of The Secret Commonwealth, which is one of the first books on fairies, was allegedly changed into a stock himself and entombed in a tree. What's interesting about the term stock in fairy folklore is that stocks are often used for horticultural hybridization. A stock is a horticultural technique whereby tissues of plants are joined so as to continue their growth together. The upper part of the combined plant is called the scion, while the lower part is called the rootstock. The success of this joining requires that the vascular tissue grow together, and such joining is called inosculation. The technique is most commonly used in asexual propagation of commercially grown plants for the horticultural and agricultural trades. Again, a wonderful manifestation, a reification, if you will, of this idea of hybridization. It's also interesting to note that the etymology of plant, Old English plant, is seedling, and the Welsh plinton, child, is a changeling. So you actually have the sort of root between changeling and plant manifesting there as well. The stock and hybridity angle is compelling, but how does this log idea manifest itself in the alien hybrid lore that I've mentioned? Obviously, abductees aren't describing little log babies that they're given. That seems very, very British Isles folklore. You're not seeing this in modern abduction. However, as I mentioned, the stock is a symbol of hybridity. But what's really interesting to me is that individuals who have supposedly held these alien hybrid babies, when shown their hands under a black light, report seeing a red fluorescent markings on their hands where they've actually held these hybrid babies, like some sort of residue is left behind. This comes from the MUFON Journal of May 1998. Similarly, there was another example of a ufologist named Eve Lorgan who said that there was a reddish pink color that people who had held alien hybrid babies would get on their hands. Well, what shows up as this color under blacklight? Chlorophyll. Now, I'm not saying that alien hybrids are actually plant people or something, but again, it's that manifestation of this motif again in such very specific, in this case, scientific ways that I think we should really acknowledge. So, to make the comparison clear, one of the ways that fairies would exchange children was to leave behind a log. And on the other hand, people who handle these hybrid babies have some sort of residue on their hands that under a black light looks just like chlorophyll. It's a really, really interesting correlation there. You don't really see children described as being log-like in the abduction lore, with this one exception that I found. You'll see this in the second full paragraph, third paragraph if you're counting the top one, which is partial. A woman claims that her alien hybrid baby looked like a scaly brown cocooned child. But some of the imagery and some of the pageantry that you'll find in the alien hybrid experience is also mirrored in plant horticulture today. Lots of times you'll have these baby farms, in some cases described as being arranged similar to a Christmas tree. But you'll find a lot of these stories about people who are abductees seeing these babies being grown in tubes. And to me, this automatically looks like a hydroponics farm or something along those lines. So, there is the contention that perhaps these human-alien hybrids are these empty shells. Whatever they are, it's really unclear. As I've alluded to in the past, I'm not sure how much I believe in the literal existence of these things, but the motifs are there, and they are strong, and they're very consistent. And that really sums up my talk. So I would like to thank everybody for being here. It's been a real pleasure. If you're interested in my work, joshuacutchin.com is my website. I have several books out, including the one that this presentation is based on, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions, with the creepiest cover that I've ever had. But I'm especially proud of this work, and it makes a little bit more sense when you can see it all laid out in front of you. But yeah, I think that fairies and aliens might be the same thing, and it's all about how our culture interprets them and what is sort of culturally acceptable at the time. So thanks so much, everyone.
So Joshua, wonderful job. Haven't really received any questions in the chat yet. Let's give it another minute or two. A lot of people are thanking you. They found it very interesting, wonderful presentation, fun presentation. Great presentation, very interesting.
Well, I very much appreciate it. It's a little bit out there and esoteric in some ways. You know, when I talk to people about having interest in fairy folklore, they don't quite know what to make of it, because they do go to that Tinkerbell concept. But you know, I don't want to mess with fairies myself. I had the fortunate opportunity to visit Ireland circa 2017, and it was interesting the number of people who would, even young people whom I would talk to, and they would say something along the lines of, "I don't believe in fairies, but I'm scared of them." So it's really interesting. But this folklore is actually really quite alive and well.
Jack says you are certainly a scholar on the subject, and Ellen says check out the big island of Hawaii. They talk about the little people all the time.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, the Menehune, which are sometimes conflated with the Night Marchers, but there's a strong comparison. You know, I've gotten some pushback. On describing the Menehune as Hawaiian fairies, but because some people think that means that I'm saying the Western European model is somehow superior. That's not really it. But when you look at the Menehune, which are short entities that you don't want to mess with, that you know, if you like build a building in one of their pathways, can interfere with your life, and they tend to hang around old ruins, and there are these old forts, these old stone structures in Hawaii that no one knows whom built them, and they're associated with the Menehune. There's a real strong comparison between the Western European fairy folklore and the Menehune folklore of Hawaii.
Lenny would like to know, has anyone taken any pictures or videos of fairies?
Nothing that I would really, I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to talk to about that, because I'm super cynical about video and photographic evidence. You know, having said that, there are some very famous fairy photographs from the turn of the century, the Cottingley fairy photographs, which are generally accepted as hoaxes. Although there is one photo that the girls said, well, all these other photos are fake, but this one is true. You'll see plenty of stuff on YouTube. I'm not sure that a lot of it's not doctored. I'm not really sure if this phenomena would show up on video as video evidence.
All right, we have two last questions, or a question and a comment. Brianna says, very interesting. Lots of similarities with the Newkirk's Hellier. Hopefully you know what that is, Josh.
Yeah. Greg and Dana Newkirk are good friends of mine, and I actually interestingly gave this presentation at their Phenomenon event back in May. But yeah, it's interesting how I was sort of working on this at the same time that they were working on season 1 of Hellier, I believe, and it just all sort of dovetails. And my new book on Bigfoot, the Where the Footprints In, actually has some overlap with Hellier season 2 and their discussion of Pan and the Green Man quite a bit.
And so before I ask this last question, something I neglected to mention at the beginning, everyone who is here tonight will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning. In the email will be a link to a feedback survey. Please take that and let me know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events here virtually at the library. Last question, yes.
It looks like yeah, Lori, yeah. So it's Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions. And it's somebody mentioned the scholarly angle about this. I have 600 sources and about 1,600 endnotes. So this book just leads to more books that you can read on the subject for sure.
Excellent. So Lori, thanks for giving Josh another opportunity to plug his book. And Josh, you have the last word. Anything you want to leave us with? Any final thoughts?
I just hope that everyone has a wonderful Halloween season, and I really appreciate all the kind feedback. And yeah, happy Halloween, everyone.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Josh. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I hope everyone has a great night. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And I hope to see many of you next Friday or at some of our other upcoming Friday programs. Thank you all and have a great night.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.